Okay, we're going to look at a number of perspectives on the topic of motivation in the workplace and in general. I think it's important to note that the topic of motivation, as most topics in management, is nothing new historically speaking, and it reaches back millennia. And people like Plato and Aristotle wrote about that phenomenon. Uh, and I think the oldest, historically speaking, perspective on motivation is referred to as hedonism. That theory presumes that people act because of certain principles, and those principles have to do with desire to avoid pain and seek pleasure. That's the essence of hedonism. Now, of course, as even though it explains many things we can envision in terms of what drives our behavior, um, there is each theory, in fact, has some limitations. That's one of the reasons why we need so many theories to explain that pretty much complex phenomenon, because there is no one way to explain motivation for everybody. It is pretty much uh, an individual experience. One of the limitations of hedonism as a predictive theory, because that's what theories are supposed to do: predict and eventually control behavior, is the fact that it explains an individual's behavior post facto. Because we all know, just from our observations and experience, that what's desirable for some may be painful for others, and vice versa. So obviously, that alludes to capture that one explanation for all behaviors. Later on, other approaches evolved that attempted to explain the phenomenon of motivation. And instinct theory could be counted as the follow-up theory. And fundamentally, that theory attempted to explain the behavior, explain the motivation by the presence of some sort of genes, right? So we misbehave, our employee misbehaves in the workplace because he or she has a certain type of a gene that make them behave that way, make them behave inappropriately. Um, Now, of course, it's that theory has many critics because it has its limitations, explanatory limitations. It's difficult to imagine that there is a gene for every possible human behavior. Like, for example, tardiness or absenteeism, just to give a few examples. So the next theory that followed had to do is referred to uh, as drive theory, and has to do with human needs. So instincts now have been replaced with human needs, um, and the reason for the replacement was simple. Needs are simply easier to define, to control, and explained the human motivation as a consequence of a certain tension between unmet and met needs. Of course, the bigger the space and between those two extremes, the bigger the tension, and the bigger the motivation, stronger the motivation to act in certain ways. Now, of course, again, as every other limitation, every other theory before, this theory has also some limitations, and they have to do mainly with the fact that, again, it doesn't predict all possible behaviors, especially, for instance, why is it that we eat when we are not hungry, right? The need is met, and yet we do behave in a certain way. The same way might have to do with resting. Why do we rest when we are not tired? Well, that theory doesn't quite explain that phenomena. Then we are moving to incentive theories, and they are unique, especially in comparison with the previously discussed theories, because they take our motivation outside a person. Um, in other words, the human motivation is the reason we pick up certain things, motivated to act in a certain way, is because of behavioral conditioning, punishment, and rewards. So, in other words, we the theory presumes that certain behavior is going to be reinforced and will repeat itself in the future if it has been followed by a positive reinforcement, something it sort of goes back to hedonism, that it's something we receive something that gives us pleasure. So it's a positive reinforcement. And on the other hand, the theory goes that if certain behaviors are followed by negative consequences, something we don't like, um, then, such as, for example, demotion, then the theory goes that those kind of behaviors will be extinct in the future. And the difference between incentive theory and the previous three have to do with the externalities of those conditioning factors, whereas the other three have to do with something that happens within us, our heads, instinct, needs, desires that makes us do things. Here, what makes us do things are things we are not really that aware of, but nevertheless, on a somewhat of an instinctual level, that's what behaviors would make us believe, make us do things. And finally, the most current approaches have to do with cognitive theories, and those theories presume full impact of our cognitions, and assumes that humans act rationally, and our actions are determined primarily by things like our intentions, our perceptions, our beliefs, and of course the weakness of that theory is that, of course, it's difficult to define such delicate things as intentions, and then define it, measure it, and then eventually control it from the management standpoint. The word motivation comes from the Latin word movere, which basically means movement, and implies that motivation has to do with some kind of forces that make people do certain things, like showing up at work and, of course, giving the best while at work. Now, it's easier said than done, but fundamentally, the definition stands on two legs. Those are fundamentally forces that initiate and sustain human behavior. So we have two parts of it: initiation of action and then sustaining it over a prolonged period of time. The initiation part, one leg, has to do with human needs. First, on a cognitive level, psychological needs, and the lower level needs that have to do with pay and benefits, and meeting social needs as well. And of course that for motivation to truly being in place, those two have to be matched together, and in a sense that individual individual employee has to have a properly designed reward structure, again on top, on the cognitive psychological level, in terms of intrinsic rewards, and the lower level as well, the rewards that would meet the lower level needs on the Maslow's hierarchy. And truly the person who made probably the biggest contribution when it comes to structuring this whole system of thinking about motivation, and within the context of the hierarchy of needs, was Frederick Herzberg, who divided that hierarchy into two major areas that he referred to as top one motivators, which included psychological aspects of work, cognitive aspects of work, which was expressed through a sense of achievement, sense of accomplishment, responsibilities, learning opportunities. Well, any things that had to do with things that we're processing in our heads, and of course the lower level needs, referred to also as extrinsic rewards versus intrinsic rewards on the cognitive part, that had to do with pay, benefits, and the social interactions, which were defined as the hygiene factors, which de facto meant that they had to be present, but if they were present, it only made sure that it prevented dissatisfaction going down, but it didn't motivate people. That presence did not motivate employees to work harder. So, according to Herzberg, if we want to motivate people to work harder, and that is the job of a manager, we need to focus on things that relate to higher level needs, and that is to create a challenging work environment, give people autonomy to make decisions, and create learning environments. Now, the differentiation that Herzberg created between motivators on top and hygiene factors at the bottom of the hierarchy has to do with the distinction between intrinsic rewards slash motivation on top, and extrinsic rewards slash motivation at the bottom. And whereas extrinsic rewards are relatively easy to define and imagine, of course they have to do again with pay, benefits, and social relationships. Whereas intrinsic motivation has to do with intellectual processing of the information, and that can happen on two levels. That is the IQ and EQ distinction. IQ would represent that intellectual reasoning and learning in a workplace, and EQ, emotional quotient, would have to do with dealing with affective aspects of our work. So, in other words, drawing on this distinction, we might conclude from a practical standpoint that if a manager wants to create a motivational environment in the workplace, that they should focus on those two aspects of work. In other words, employees should be able to develop themselves intellectually, so there should be learning opportunities created on some levels, but they should also be able to have some fun while at work. Now we have to remember that Hertzberg did his research in the 60s, uh, and since then a lot of research has been done on the nature of motivation and the rewards. And today we are finding that both extrinsic and intrinsic rewards, extrinsic in a sense, for example, money, most representative, and intrinsic, let's say, autonomous workplace, uh, have both additive and independent impact on motivation. In other words, somebody comes to work because, let's say, they love it, so they come to work for intrinsic reasons. Adding money, extrinsic rewards, would have a independent and additive impact on person's motivation. In other words, overall motivation would increase, and vice versa. If people come to work purely for extrinsic reasons, such as pay, adding more responsibility or autonomy in most cases would add to overall motivation in the workplace.